There is a document buried inside the Book of Psalms that most people read as poetry and dismiss as ancient prayer. They miss the architecture hidden inside its language. They see the literary beauty and overlook the structural blueprint. Psalm 72 is attributed to Solomon, the wealthiest ruler in recorded history. And when you read it not as devotional comfort, but as a legal instrument, a framework for how wealth moves from one generation to the next, it transforms entirely. It stops being a prayer and becomes a protocol. It stops being a song and becomes a script. And the principles encoded within it explain something that modern estate planning, with all its sophisticated legal mechanisms, consistently fails to address. Why most generational wealth transfers eventually collapse, and what Solomon understood about preventing that collapse before it begins. The statistics are stark and well documented. 70% of wealthy families lose their accumulated wealth by the second generation. By the third generation, that number climbs to 90%. Researchers, financial planners, and behavioral economists have studied this pattern for decades and arrived at essentially the same conclusion. The failure isn't financial. It isn't a matter of poor investment decisions or insufficient tax planning. The failure is philosophical. The second generation receives money without receiving the mindset that created it. The third generation receives neither. And so the wealth that one person spent a lifetime building quietly dissolves within 2 or 3 generations, not through catastrophe but through gradual erosion of the values and disciplines that made its creation possible. Solomon watched this pattern repeat across the households of his kingdom and understood it with a clarity that no modern financial textbook has yet surpassed. Psalm 72 begins with a specific and precise request. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. This opening line contains a wealth transfer framework that most readers completely overlook. Solomon is not simply asking for divine blessing on his reign. He is articulating the only mechanism through which genuine wealth can successfully transfer across generations: the transfer of wisdom before the transfer of assets. He asks for justice and righteousness to pass to the royal son before asking for prosperity, dominion, or material inheritance. The sequencing is deliberate and instructive. In ancient Hebrew thought, the word mishpat, translated as justice, carried legal and administrative connotation. It meant the capacity to make right judgments, to govern well, to steward resources responsibly. Solomon understood that wealth without this capacity is merely a countdown to dissipation. Consider what David demonstrated when transferring his accumulated wealth and kingdom to Solomon. In 1 Chronicles 22, we read that David assembled staggering resources for the temple project: 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, iron and bronze beyond weighing, timber and stone in abundance. But he didn't simply deposit these resources with Solomon and step aside. He spent years transferring vision, instruction, and wisdom alongside the material wealth. He prepared Solomon intellectually and spiritually before handing over the assets. He imparted the why before communicating the what. This is the Psalm 72 principle operating in practice. The righteous transfer is always wisdom first, wealth second. Reverse that order and you have created not a legacy, but a liability. The middle section of Psalm 72 describes what a righteous steward of wealth actually does with resources. And this description functions as a job description that any legitimate heir must be prepared to fulfill. He will deliver the needy when they cry. He will spare the poor. He will redeem their lives from oppression and violence. Precious will be their blood in his sight. Modern readers often interpret these verses purely in political or theological terms, missing their profound economic dimension. A king in ancient Israel was the chief economic actor in the nation. His relationship to the poor and vulnerable was not a charitable sidebar to his wealth management. It was the central test of whether his wealth was legitimate, productive, and therefore sustainable. Wealth that exploits the vulnerable to perpetuate itself was understood not as true wealth but as borrowed time, a temporary accumulation awaiting redistribution. Proverbs 1:22 p.m. states this principle with directness. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but a sinner's wealth is stored up for the righteous. The contrast here isn't between the financially successful and the financially unsuccessful. It's between wealth built on righteous foundations and wealth extracted through exploitation. The former compounds across generations. The latter eventually transfers, through economic or social mechanisms, to those whose stewardship is more aligned with genuine productivity. Solomon observed this pattern across generations of families in his kingdom and recognized that the quality of the wealth's foundation determined its longevity far more than the quantity of assets accumulated. The wealth transfer described in Psalm 72 is also notable for what it reveals about the mechanism of accumulation. Verses 10 through 15 speak of the kings of Tarshish bringing tribute, the kings of Sheba presenting gifts, and gold from Sheba being given to him. These aren't random expressions of poetic grandeur. They reflect the actual mechanisms of Solomon's historical wealth: trade networks, diplomatic relationships, strategic partnerships, and the reputation for wisdom that attracted resources from distant nations. 1 Kings 10 documents how the Queen of Sheba traveled to Jerusalem specifically because of Solomon's reputation, and left after presenting him with 120 talents of gold plus spices and precious stones in quantities never seen again. Solomon's annual income from these networks reached 666 talents of gold, roughly equivalent to $1 billion in modern purchasing power, not through conquest or extraction, but through the gravitational pull of demonstrated wisdom and just governance. This is the asset that Psalm 72 is actually describing. Not gold, not silver, not the ships of Tarshish returning laden with Ophir's treasures. The asset is the magnetic quality of righteousness and wisdom that generates voluntary wealth transfer from external sources without coercion. Nations brought gifts to Solomon not because they were forced to, but because proximity to his wisdom created value for them. The relationships themselves were productive. The reputation itself was an asset that compounded faster than any material holding. And this asset, unlike physical wealth, cannot be inherited passively. It must be cultivated, demonstrated, and earned by each successive steward. This is why Solomon's specific prayer in Psalm 72 was not for resources, but for the capacity to deserve them. Jewish tradition formalized this understanding through the practice of the ethical will, known in Hebrew as a Tzavaah, while modern estate planning focuses almost entirely on the distribution of assets through legal documents. The Jewish tradition demanded that every person also compose a Tzavaah, a document transferring not money but values, principles, wisdom accumulated through a lifetime of experience. The Rambam, writing in his legal code Mishneh Torah, specifically noted that maintaining harmony among heirs required far more than clear distribution of assets. It required that parents transmit the reasoning behind their decisions, the values that shape their stewardship, and the vision for how wealth should be used, rather than merely possessed. This is directly aligned with Psalm 72's structure. The prayer for wisdom to govern precedes and supersedes the description of material abundance. The third-generation curse, that 90% dissolution rate, can be traced in almost every case to the absence of a tzeva. The first generation builds through direct experience of the disciplines required: restraint, patience, strategic thinking, deferred gratification, the willingness to invest rather than consume. These disciplines are embedded in their bones through the difficulty of building from less. The second generation observes the successful outcome of those disciplines without fully internalizing the process. They inherit habits alongside assets, though the habits are somewhat diluted. The third generation inherits only the assets and the comfortable lifestyle those assets support. The disciplines have been lost in transmission because no deliberate mechanism was created to transfer them. The money was documented, the wisdom was not, and so the dissolution begins. Solomon's Psalm 72 also reveals something profound about the relationship between justice for the vulnerable and the perpetuation of wealth. Verse 16 describes abundance of grain on the tops of mountains, fruit flourishing like Lebanon, people of the city thriving like grass of the earth, all as direct consequences of the king's righteous governance. This was not merely metaphorical aspiration. The ancient understanding connected just governance with productive ecology and genuine economic flourishing in ways that modern economic theory is only beginning to rediscover. Exploitative economic systems deplete the resources they extract. Regenerative systems, where those who create wealth also invest in the capacity of others to participate in creation, produce compounding returns that extend far beyond the original actor's lifetime. The families and communities that have maintained wealth across multiple generations without the 90% dissolution consistently demonstrate this pattern. They structure their wealth not merely for preservation and personal consumption, but for productive deployment that creates value beyond themselves. They maintain what might be called a Psalm 72 orientation, an understanding that wealth held in righteous stewardship generates more wealth through the relationships, reputations, and reciprocal networks it creates. Wealth hoarded for mere accumulation eventually stagnates and attracts predatory extraction. Wealth deployed in genuine service to something larger than personal comfort builds the kind of gravitational field that Solomon described in his psalm. Nations voluntarily bringing their treasures to a center of demonstrated wisdom and justice. The practical application of this framework begins with what David demonstrated to Solomon: the deliberate transfer of principles before assets. This means that conversations about money, stewardship, values, and purpose must begin long before any legal documents are signed, long before any inheritance changes hands, long before children become adults waiting for resources to pass to them. The financial educator must precede the estate attorney. The ethical will must be written before the legal will. The vision for what the wealth is meant to accomplish across generations must be communicated with the same precision and intention that goes into structuring the assets themselves. It also means that the next generation must demonstrate stewardship capacity before receiving stewardship responsibility. In Psalm 72, Solomon doesn't simply assume that the royal son will use wisdom well because he's been told about it. He prays that wisdom will be actively given, cultivated, and demonstrated through the governing of real circumstances, small responsibilities first, bigger ones only after demonstrated competence. The willingness to trust an heir with significant resources must be earned through visible evidence that the underlying principles have been genuinely internalized, not merely intellectually understood. Understood principles don't transfer wealth. Internalized principles do. There is also a critical lesson embedded in Psalm 72's structure about the danger of separating prosperity from purpose. The psalm never describes abundance as an end in itself. Every expression of material wealth is connected to its function, protecting the vulnerable, ensuring justice, enabling flourishing across the community. The moment wealth becomes self-referential, existing primarily to maintain and perpetuate itself rather than to serve the larger purpose that justified its accumulation, it has broken the Psalm 72 covenant. And historically, that break precedes dissolution with remarkable consistency. The first generation accumulates because they serve something larger than accumulation. Subsequent generations, if they have inherited assets without inheriting purpose, inevitably begin treating the wealth as the point rather than the instrument. Purpose has a way of returning to the wealth of those who lost it, usually by removing the wealth in the process. Modern estate planning sophistication cannot substitute for this foundational transfer. Trusts, LLC, family limited partnerships, dynasty trusts, charitable remainder trusts. All of these are legitimate tools for protecting and transferring assets with tax efficiency. But they transfer legal ownership, not wisdom. They transfer control of assets, not the capacity to steward them generatively. Solomon had no access to these instruments and built wealth that attracted tribute from the ends of the known world. He had something far more valuable: a clear understanding of what made wealth legitimate, what sustained it across generations, and what inevitably caused its dissolution when those foundations were abandoned. The Psalm 72 asset is fundamentally unconfiscatable. Economic crashes can destroy portfolios. Inflation can erode currency holdings. Real estate markets collapse. Businesses fail. But the wisdom that generates wealth, the reputation for just dealing, the relational networks built through demonstrated integrity, the capacity to see opportunity where others see only chaos, these travel across generations when they are deliberately and intentionally transferred. David transferred them to Solomon through years of specific instruction and visible example. The result was a reign of such prosperity that silver was said to be as common as stone in Jerusalem. The transfer worked not because of the assets David accumulated, but because of the principles he transmitted before those assets changed hands. This is the legal script that Psalm 72 contains. Not a specific investment allocation or a tax optimization strategy, a sequenced protocol. Wisdom before wealth, purpose before assets, demonstrated competence before transferred responsibility, ethical will alongside legal will, generational vision alongside individual comfort. The families that follow this protocol don't just transfer wealth, They transfer the capacity to create it, which means the wealth compounds rather than dissolves across each successive generation. And the families that ignore this protocol, no matter how brilliantly they accumulate in one generation, are simply deferring the 90% dissolution that the statistics have been documenting for as long as anyone has been keeping records. Solomon asked for justice and righteousness for the royal son before asking for anything else. He understood that the answer to that prayer was the only inheritance worth having, and the only mechanism through which every other form of wealth could be genuinely preserved. Begin your wealth transfer there, and everything that follows has a foundation. Begin it anywhere else, and you are simply accelerating the timeline toward the statistics that have already been written.